Chris Van Hollen didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture, grandstand, or search for a camera. He simply leaned in, looked directly at the Attorney General, and asked the one question she seemed desperate to avoid. And the moment the words left his mouth, the entire room changed. Because what he asked wasn't political theater. It went to the heart of whether the Department of Justice still has a pulse, or whether its moral compass has quietly slipped off the table. He started with a story most people would have missed in the chaos of daily headlines: a 15-year DOJ veteran, Erez Ruveni, stepping forward with a whistleblower complaint that stunned even longtime staffers.
Madam Attorney General, yesterday, Erez Ruveni filed a whistleblower complaint against the Department of Justice. As I think you know, he was a 15-year veteran of the Department of Justice. He received commendations during the first Trump administration for all his work at DOJ, but he filed a detailed account of his recent experience at the Department of Justice, saying that prior to his determination, that he was terminated after he refused to sign an appeal brief that was unsupported by evidence or the law. And he says, "I didn't sign up to lie." In response to his termination, you made a statement on Fox News a little while ago saying, "At my direction, every Department of Justice attorney is required to zealously advocate on behalf of the United States, and that any attorney who fails to abide by this direction will face consequences." So, General Bondi, I guess the direct question is, he says he was fired because he didn't want to make an untruthful statement to a court of law. I have two questions. Number one, I assume you agree that zealous advocacy does not mean telling untruths to courts of law. And second, if that's not the case, what did you mean by saying he was not a zealous advocate?
Senator Van Hollen, this is all pending litigation, as you're well aware, and the timing of it, I can't discuss pending litigation. This is a whistleblower lawsuit pending within my office, but I will say the timing of it I find suspect, as he takes hits at Emil Bovee, who is one of the best human beings I know, one of the smartest, brilliant men I know, who will soon become a federal judge. And his hearing happens to be today, and I find the irony of the timing of it pretty remarkable, the lawsuit. But this had to do with attorney-client privilege information that was disclosed. I can't talk about the substance, but what I will tell you, and you have obviously my word, any zealous advocacy means to be done ethically and honestly, always. And that's what I mean by zealous advocacy. He also accused Emil Bovee of things that Todd Blanche, who is one of the best human beings I also know, my deputy attorney general, was in the room and said did not happen. But again, I wish I could get into greater detail. I can't because it's pending. But I stand by Emil Bovee and I stand by Todd Blanche every day, and I always will.
Well, Madam Attorney General, I will say that his account seems to have lots of information. So as you say, this will obviously be something that's litigated or reviewed through due process procedures. But I have to say that it's very, very disturbing. We've also heard from others in other departments who are responsible for implementing the laws of the United States, that they feel uncomfortable about having been asked to do things that they thought were unethical. Let me go on to some of the budget questions, and I really want to follow up on my colleagues, Senator Moran and Senator Collins. But the DOJ grant funding is being sort of cut back on two fronts. One, in April, the department terminated hundreds of grant awards, notifying grantees that their current grant funds were gone, effective immediately. That included, law enforcement training grants, technical assistance awards, some dating back to fiscal year, I think, 2017. So question number one is, are you going to be releasing those funds? The second concern regarding grants has to do with the monies that were appropriated in this fiscal year, in March. And my understanding is that DOJ is withholding an overwhelming number of notices of funding opportunities, NOFOs, meaning that grantees who rely on these grants, including many who provide services to victims of crimes, are literally in some cases running out of money. For example, the department's biggest grant-making component, the Office of Justice Programs, has only posted one notice for fiscal year 25, NOFO notice. So if you could answer the question with respect to both those pieces.
Sure, and that's a very valid question, Senator. The notices will be going out in coming weeks about the grants. And we did cut grants by 6%, and I'm here to tell every senator, if we did cut a grant that you care about that is specific to your state, please contact me. I've turned on grants that were cut off. So please, if that happens, there's an appeal process, but you can pick up the phone and you can call me, and I would be more than happy to look at that. I never want to take away a grant that is actually helping Americans, helping victims, helping law enforcement, and we're looking at it on a case-by-case basis, and many of those are being appealed already, but you have my word, we will look at all of those, absolutely.
Thank you. And in terms of the other piece of the question, when the notices for information will go out, because the fiscal year obviously is, running out, and we are hearing from lots of entities that are waiting for those notices so they can apply for the grant funding.
Yeah, yes, Senator. The notice of funding is consistent with our priorities, and they're finalizing it right now. It will be going out very shortly.
Very shortly. All right. Thank you.
It'll be posted on a rolling basis, too, I believe.
Okay. If you could just keep us posted on that. And I would appreciate it, Madam Attorney General, if you could have your team or respond to a letter that about 30 senators wrote to you on this topic of the prior fiscal year funds that were frozen.
I will make sure they look at that letter. I think we've received probably thousands of letters.
You've gotten lots of letters. But we really do need, in order to do our job, to get responses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Attorney General.
His claim wasn't small or symbolic. He said he was pushed to sign a legal brief that wasn't backed by facts, pressured to endorse something he believed would mislead the court. And when he refused, when he said "I didn't sign up to lie," his career ended. Those words were the crack that exposed everything else, and Van Hollen knew it. So he asked Bondi something simple, something any attorney general should answer without hesitation. Does zealous advocacy include telling untruths to a court? And what did she mean when she said Ruveni wasn't being a zealous advocate? But instead of answering, Bondi retreated behind a wall of pending litigation, a phrase she repeated so frequently you could feel the discomfort behind it. She didn't defend the truth. She defended her team, calling them the best human beings she knew. She didn't reassure the public that lying under oath was unacceptable. She pivoted, deflected, and turned the moment into a loyalty pledge for her deputies. And that's where Van Hollen's reaction became impossible to ignore. Because he wasn't just challenging a legal answer, he was calling out an entire culture that seemed to prize allegiance over honesty. When a whistleblower with 15 years of service says he was punished for refusing to lie and the AG can't say lying is wrong, you're not dealing with a personnel dispute. You're dealing with a system in freefall. Van Hollen didn't let it go. He reminded everyone listening that Ruveni's long career wasn't the only warning sign. Others across government had quietly voiced concerns about being asked to do things that felt unethical. And while those stories rarely made headlines, they formed a troubling pattern: pressure behind the scenes, retaliation for honesty, and a creeping fear that truth had become optional. But what made the moment even more striking wasn't Ruveni's story alone. It was the contrast between the whistleblower's clarity and Bondi's response. He said he refused to lie. She said she couldn't comment. He said he was fired for choosing integrity. She said the timing was suspicious. He spoke plainly, she spoke politically. And just when it seemed like the tension couldn't climb any higher, Van Hollen shifted to something even more alarming, something affecting communities across the entire country. Hundreds of DOJ grants had been abruptly terminated or frozen, no warning, no explanation. These weren't small programs or experimental pilot projects. They were grants that funded law enforcement training, victim support services, and critical community programs that save lives. Some had been running for years, others were brand new. All of them were suddenly gone. To the people relying on them, it felt like the ground had been kicked out from under them. Van Hollen calmly laid out the facts in April. Bondi's department had terminated hundreds of grants, notifying grantees that their funds were gone immediately. Victim service providers were running out of money. Law enforcement training programs were halted mid-progress. Tech assistance programs that kept communities safe were dead overnight. And on top of that, DOJ hadn't released new grant notices for the current fiscal year, leaving thousands of organizations stuck in limbo. When he asked Bondi why funds appropriated by Congress were being withheld, why communities were being left stranded, her answer raised more questions than it resolved. She said the department had cut grants by 6%. She said senators could call her directly if they didn't like a grant being cut. She said notices would go out soon. Very soon, but there were no specifics, no timelines, no explanation of why programs were frozen in the first place. The message unintentionally revealed something more unsettling: decisions being made in ways that didn't feel transparent or neutral. If a program could survive because a senator made a phone call, what did that say about the process? If programs supporting victims could be paused indefinitely while new priorities were being finalized, what did that say about the department's values? Observers watching the exchange felt an uneasy pattern emerging: a whistleblower punished for refusing to lie, grant programs cut without clarity, a culture where questioning decisions is treated as disloyalty, and a leadership team whose main defense wasn't truth, but personal praise for colleagues. Van Hollen wasn't shouting about corruption. He was pointing to something quieter but just as dangerous: a justice system drifting into a place where truth bends to pressure, policies bend to politics, and integrity becomes a liability instead of a duty. Bondi repeatedly shielded herself with pending litigation, but those three words couldn't hide the discomfort in the room. When someone asks whether lying to a court is acceptable, no attorney general should need a legal shield to answer. And yet that's exactly what Bondi reached for, not once, but again and again. For people familiar with DOJ culture, that said more than any admission could, because the department isn't just a building, or a collection of offices, or a hierarchy of titles. It's a promise. A promise that the law stands above personal loyalty, political pressure, or institutional self-protection. When that promise starts to slip, even a little, the consequences ripple far beyond one whistleblower. And while Van Hollen kept his tone even, you could hear the warning in every one of his questions. A warning that the department's credibility doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes piece by piece, decision by decision, silence by silence. Even as the conversation turned back to grants, something about the whistleblower discussion lingered in the air. Because the story of Erez Raveni wasn't just about one man, it was a mirror reflecting the internal pressures no department wants the public to see. A mirror Bondi tried to look away from the moment it was placed in front of her. She focused on defending her deputies instead of addressing the accusation. She emphasized timing instead of substance. She suggested sabotage instead of acknowledging the seriousness of the claim. It was a calculated shift from the moral question to the political one, but Van Hollen kept steering it back, not with anger but with clarity. He reminded her that this wasn't about personal loyalty conflicts or rivalries. It was about whether the nation's top law enforcement office was signaling that the truth could be bent, stretched, or ignored whenever it became inconvenient. Bondi's answer, "I can't discuss pending litigation," became the shield she relied on every time the questions got too close. But a shield doesn't erase concern, it only confirms it. And while Bondi talked about her faith in her deputies, something else happened in the room. It became clear that Raveni wasn't alone, that others had felt the same pressure, that internal discomfort wasn't isolated. And while those voices weren't on the witness stand, their stories echoed through the whistleblower's complaint. There was a moment barely noticeable, unless you were paying attention, when Van Hollen paused and looked down at his notes, not to check a fact, but almost as if reminding himself that this wasn't just about politics, it was about principle. Because if the standard becomes advocate for the government at any cost, the cost becomes the truth. And when Bondi claimed the lawsuit was timed to sabotage a colleague's judicial hearing, that comment landed with a thud. Not because it was surprising, but because it implied that criticism, any criticism, was inherently political. That whistleblowers couldn't be acting out of conscience. That truth itself was suspect if it arrived at the wrong moment. Moments like that reveal more than testimony ever will. As the questioning continued, the tension in the room shifted. This wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was a stress test of the justice system's integrity. And every answer Bondi gave made that test harder to pass. When the topic moved back to grants, it wasn't a relief, it deepened the concern. Because if the department could abruptly freeze grants affecting victims and law enforcement without explanation, what else could be done without transparency? Who decides which programs survive? Who decides which communities get support? And what happens when funding becomes a tool rather than a duty? The answers weren't clear, and that was the problem. By the time Van Hollen wrapped his questioning, viewers online had already started reacting. People who normally wouldn't follow a DOJ budget hearing were suddenly paying attention, because the story wasn't about money or paperwork, it was about trust. A whistleblower says he refused to lie, an attorney general refuses to say lying is wrong, hundreds of grants disappear, victim services lose funding, senators beg for timelines, and the only constant is a wall of evasions. It all added up to something larger, something viewers could feel even if they hadn't followed the details. A justice system only works if the people behind it choose truth over convenience. When that choice becomes negotiable, everything else falls apart. That's why Van Hollen's reaction mattered, not because it was viral or flashy, but because it was honest. Because he asked the question any citizen would ask. Because he didn't let the moment slide into political fog. He held the line, and through his calm persistence, he exposed the cracks that others hoped would stay hidden. And that's the lesson viewers are left with. Democracy doesn't erode with explosions, it erodes with silence, with fear, with unanswered questions, with whistleblowers punished, and truth brushed aside. If you believe the justice system should answer to facts, not to pressure, not to politics, not to personal loyalty, then this moment matters more than most people realize. Stay informed, stay curious, and make sure this story reaches more people who need to see it. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this video so more people understand what's happening behind the scenes. Your attention is the one thing powerful institutions can't ignore.